You think your choices are yours, but most of them were decided long before you became aware of them. Imagine yourself standing at a threshold, your hand hovering over a door handle you've turned 1,000 times before. Behind that door is a room filled with shadows, sharp edges, and the lingering scent of a fire that burned you. Your skin still stings from the heat. Your pulse quickens with the memory of the last time you stood here, yet your fingers tighten on the metal. There is a strange, magnetic pull in the wood, an invitation written in the language of bruises and apologies. You know what is behind that door. You know it will hurt. And yet, you turn the handle. You probably think your choices are yours, but your brain made most of them long before you noticed. It isn't a lack of intelligence that brings you back here. It is the hidden architecture of a mind that prefers a familiar hell to an unfamiliar heaven. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're watching from and what time your mind decided to question itself tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's step quietly into the hidden architecture of the human mind. The first trap is one of accounting. In economics, we speak of the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue an endeavor once an investment in money, effort, or time has been made, even if the current costs outweigh the future benefits. But when this logic enters the realm of the heart, it becomes a devastating cognitive distortion. You look at the person who caused you pain, and you don't see a source of distress. You see a repository of your own years. You see the late-night conversations, the shared secrets, the sacrifices you made to keep the peace, and the massive emotional capital you've poured into a failing enterprise. To walk away now feels less like a liberation and more like a bankruptcy. Your brain whispers a dangerous lie. If I stay just a little longer, perhaps I can finally recoup the loss. Maybe this is happening to you right now. You find yourself justifying another chance not because the other person has changed, but because you cannot bear the thought that the last 3 years were for nothing. Psychologists still debate whether the sunk cost fallacy is a purely cognitive error or an evolutionary adaptation designed to keep social groups together during times of scarcity. Regardless of its origin in the context of a painful relationship, it acts as a mental anchor. You aren't returning to the person. You are returning to the version of yourself that still believed the investment would pay off. You are trying to protect the you of yesterday from the realization that they were wrong. Consider the endowment effect, a psychological phenomenon where we ascribe more value to things merely because we own them. You own this history. You own this pain. Because it is yours, your brain inflates its value. If a stranger described the exact same treatment to you, you would tell them to run. You would see the irrationality with surgical clarity. But because you are the one inside the system, the bias blinds you. You treat your emotional history as a physical asset. We are biologically wired to be loss-averse. Daniel Kahneman famously demonstrated that the pain of losing is twice as powerful as the joy of gaining. To lose this person, even if they hurt, you feels like a catastrophic loss of self. Your System 1 thinking, that fast, instinctive, and emotional part of your mind, is screaming at you to avoid the loss at all costs. You assume that your memory is a recording device, but it is actually a storyteller. When you are away from the source of your pain, your mind begins to engage in rosy retrospection. It filters out the sharp edges of the arguments and the coldness of the silence, leaving behind a curated highlight reel of the moments that felt like home. This is a hidden manipulation of your own consciousness. Your brain is trying to solve the discomfort of loneliness by offering a distorted map of the past. You remember the way they laughed at that one dinner, but you conveniently forget the way they made you feel invisible for the 3 weeks that followed. There is a certain dark philosophy in the way we cling to what breaks us. We are creatures of habit, and habit is often mistaken for destiny. We often think of pain as a signal to stop, but in the intricate dance of human psychology, pain can become a landmark. If you have spent enough time in a state of distress, that distress becomes your baseline. It becomes the known. The silence of a healthy life can feel terrifyingly empty to a mind that has been conditioned to the noise of conflict. You return because you know the rules of this particular game, even if the game is rigged against you. You prefer the predictable sting to the unpredictable void of being alone. You trust your instincts, but your instincts are currently using outdated data. They are operating on a survival mechanism that values social cohesion over individual well-being. In the primal past, being cast out from the tribe meant death. Thus, the brain developed a deep, visceral terror of disconnection. When you return to someone who has hurt you, you are often responding to that ancient reptilian fear. Your mind perceives the pain of the person as a manageable threat, while the pain of isolation is perceived as an existential one. You are making what feels like a choice, but it is actually a sophisticated form of damage control orchestrated by a subconscious that is terrified of the dark. Think back to that door handle. Your hand is still on it. You feel the weight of every hour you've spent trying to fix what was never yours to repair. You think you are being loyal or perhaps resilient, but the hidden truth is that you are caught in a cognitive loop, a feedback system that rewards the hope of fixing more than the reality of leaving. The mind is a master of self-deception. It would rather you walk back into the fire than admit that the fire is all there is. You aren't just returning to a person. You are returning to the scene of a crime where you are both the victim and the lead investigator, hoping that this time the evidence will finally change. Remember that false certainty from earlier, the idea that you are simply invested in a person while the sunk cost keeps you anchored. There is a more aggressive biological machinery at play that turns your pain into a craving. You might notice that when you are away from this person, the discomfort isn't just emotional, it feels physical. Your chest tightens, your focus fractures, and a restless energy gnaws at your nerves. This isn't just grief, it's withdrawal. You have been caught in a cycle of intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful psychological conditioning tool known to science, and it has turned your heart into a gambler's engine. In the mid-20th century, B.F. Skinner discovered something unsettling about the nature of persistence. He found that if you give a lab rat a pellet of food, every time it presses a lever, the rat will press the lever only when it's hungry. But if you make the reward unpredictable, if the lever only works sometimes at random intervals, the rat becomes obsessed. It will press that lever until it collapses from exhaustion. This is the variable ratio schedule. And it is the hidden blueprint behind every slot machine in Las Vegas, every social media notification, and every toxic reunion you've ever had. When the person who hurts you occasionally offers a glimpse of the person you fell in love with, they aren't just being nice. They are unknowingly installing a neurological hook. You probably assume that consistent kindness is the best way to build a bond. But humans are actually more likely to become addicted to inconsistency. When affection is guaranteed, the brain's dopamine system remains relatively quiet. But when affection is scarce and unpredictable, every "I'm sorry" or "I miss you" triggers a massive spike in dopamine, the neurotransmitter of anticipation. Psychologists still debate whether this response is a byproduct of our foraging ancestors searching for rare resources or a fundamental flaw in the mammalian reward system. Either way, you aren't returning for the pain, you are returning for the possibility of the reward. You are a gambler standing at a broken machine, convinced that the next pull will be the jackpot that justifies every lost dollar. Maybe this is happening to you right now. You find yourself checking your phone every 3 minutes, waiting for a text that you know won't change the reality of your situation. Each vibration of the device is a pull of the lever. If the message is cold, you feel the crash. If the message is warm, you feel a rush of relief so intense it feels like love. But realize this relief is not the same as happiness. It is merely the temporary cessation of agony. Your brain, however, cannot tell the difference. It begins to associate the person who caused the agony with the only source of the cure. You return to the flame because the flame is the only thing that offers the ice for the burn it gave you. This is what behavioral psychologists call hidden manipulation, though often neither party realizes they are doing it. The person who hurts you doesn't need to be a master strategist. They only need to be inconsistent. By being cruel one day and vulnerable the next, they create a psychological tension that your mind is desperate to resolve. We have a fundamental need for closure and cognitive consistency. When someone behaves in a way that contradicts their good side, your brain goes into overdrive trying to solve the puzzle. You return to them because you think that if you can just find the right words or the right behavior, you can unlock the good version of them permanently. You are trying to force a random lever to become a reliable one. You trust your feelings as if they are a moral compass, but in this state, your feelings are more like a malfunctioning GPS. They are leading you back to the source because the brain has labeled that person as a high-value target. Because the peaks of the relationship are so high boosted by the dopamine of the makeup phase, the valleys seem like a price worth paying. You are experiencing the contrast principle. A small act of kindness from a cruel person feels infinitely more meaningful than a large act of kindness from a consistently good person. You find yourself saying things like, "You don't know them like I do," or "They have a good heart deep down." In reality, you are just hyper-focusing on the rare pellets of food while ignoring the empty lever. There is a surprising hidden behavior insight here. The more someone hurts you, the more valuable their occasional kindness becomes. It is a perverse form of inflation. In a healthy relationship, a compliment is worth 1 unit of joy. In a painful, intermittent relationship, that same compliment is worth 100. You have been conditioned to survive on crumbs, so when you are finally handed a slice of bread, you treat it like a feast. This is why it is so difficult for your friends and family to understand why you go back. They see the starvation, you only see the feast. Maybe you think you are fighting for the relationship, but fighting implies a winnable battle. In the architecture of the gambling mind, there is no winning, there is only playing. The act of returning is the act of re-entering the game because the boredom and silence of not playing feels like a void your dopamine-starved brain cannot handle. You aren't addicted to the person, you are addicted to the cycle of tension and release. You are addicted to the hope that is generated in the space between the pain and the apology. Consider the Zeigarnik effect, the psychological tendency to remember uncompleted or interrupted tasks better than completed ones. A painful relationship that ends abruptly or remains messy is an uncompleted task in your mind. It sits there looping, demanding your attention. You return because your brain hates a cliffhanger. You want to go back just to see if you can write a better ending, not realizing that the script was finished long ago. Your mind is trying to close a circle that was drawn with disappearing ink. You assume that by returning, you are taking control. In reality, you are surrendering to a biological reflex. Your System 2, the slow, logical, and calculating part of your mind, knows you should stay away. It has the spreadsheets, the list of pros and cons, and the memories of the tears. But System 1, the primal gambler, is much faster. It bypasses your logic and speaks directly to your nervous system. It tells you that the only way to stop the shaking is to turn that door handle one more time. You think you are choosing to forgive, but you might just be waiting for your next hit. Remember that false certainty from earlier, the idea that you are a rational agent weighing the pros and cons of your relationships. If the intermittent rewards are the engine driving you back, then cognitive dissonance is the shield that protects you from the stinging realization that you are acting against your own interests. Your mind cannot easily hold two contradictory beliefs at once. It cannot comfortably accept, "I am a person of self-respect," and "I am staying with someone who treats me poorly." To resolve this agonizing mental friction, your brain must change one of those beliefs. Since you haven't left yet, the brain does the only thing it can. It rewrites the narrative of the pain itself. This is the dissonance reduction process, famously pioneered by Leon Festinger. When your behavior and your values clash, the resulting psychological tension is so physically uncomfortable that you will subconsciously manipulate your own logic to find peace. You begin to invent the narrative shield. You tell yourself that the pain is actually a form of growth, or that your partner's cruelty is merely a misunderstanding born of their own tragic past. You aren't just forgiving them. You are fundamentally altering your perception of reality so that you don't have to feel like a fool. You are building a mental cathedral out of excuses just so you can keep standing in the rain. Maybe this is happening to you right now. You find yourself explaining their behavior to your friends with a practiced, hollow smile. You use phrases like, "They're just going through a lot," or "You had to be there to understand the context." Psychologists still debate whether cognitive dissonance is a biological drive for consistency or a socially learned defense mechanism to maintain our public ego. Regardless, the result is the same. You become the architect of your own deception. You aren't returning to the person who caused you pain. You are returning to the version of them you invented to keep your own sanity intact. Consider the effort justification bias. Research shows that if we suffer to achieve something, we value it far more than if it had come easily. The more blood, sweat, and tears you shed for this person, the more your brain insists they must be the one. If they were just a casual acquaintance, you would have walked away months ago, but because you have suffered for them, your mind demands a payoff. To admit the relationship is a failure would be to admit that your suffering was meaningless. And the human mind finds meaningless suffering to be the most intolerable state of all. So you return to the pain to prove that the pain has a purpose. There is a surprising hidden behavior insight in the way we handle moral decoupling. We have a strange ability to separate a person's essence from their actions. You might find yourself saying, they did a bad thing, but they aren't a bad person. While this can be a sign of empathy in the context of a repetitive cycle of pain, it becomes a trap. You stop reacting to what is actually happening and start reacting to the potential you see in them. You are in love with a ghost, a version of them that only exists in your imagination and in the brief moments between the storms. You return to the ghost, ignoring the flesh and blood person who continues to hurt you. You assume that you would know if you were being manipulated, but the most effective manipulation is the kind you perform on yourself. This is the confirmation bias at its most lethal. Once you have decided that this person is worth the struggle, your brain begins to filter out all evidence to the contrary. You ignore the cold texts, the broken promises, and the hidden lies, but you hyper-focus on the one morning they brought you coffee in bed. You take that single data point and use it to validate your entire existence. You are looking for reasons to stay, and the brain is an expert at finding exactly what it's looking for, even if it has to hallucinate the results. Maybe you think your loyalty is a virtue, but in the philosophy of human nature, loyalty to a destructive force is often just a fear of self-confrontation. To leave would require you to face the sunk cost we discussed, to look in the mirror and admit that you were wrong. For many, the pain of being wrong is sharper than the pain of being hurt. We would rather be miserable in a familiar story than be a failure in a new one. You return to the source of your pain because, in that narrative, you are the long-suffering hero. If you leave, you are just another person who got it wrong. Consider the choice-supportive bias. Once you make a decision like the decision to get back together, you automatically begin to see that choice as better than it actually was. You retroactively attribute positive qualities to the decision and downplay the risks. You remember your choice as a rational act of forgiveness rather than an impulsive act of loneliness. This creates a feedback loop. The more times you return, the more correct the act of returning feels. You are training your brain to see the fire as a heater. You trust your internal voice, but that voice is currently being scripted by a mind that is desperate for harmony. It wants the world to make sense. It wants the person you love to be the person who loves you back. When they aren't, the cognitive dissonance creates a static noise in your head that you will do anything to silence. You return to the person who caused the pain because they are the only ones who can provide the evidence your brain needs to feel right again. You are looking for one "I love you" to cancel out 1,000 "I don't care about yous." Think about the stories you tell yourself when you're alone at night. Are they based on the reality of the last 6 months, or are they based on the narrative shield you've built? You think you are making a choice based on hope, but you might just be avoiding the silence that comes when the excuses stop. The mind is not always your ally. It is a survivalist, and sometimes survival means lying to yourself until the lie feels like the truth. You aren't returning to a person. You are returning to a story where you don't have to be the villain who gave up. Remember that false certainty from earlier, the belief that you are a seeker of happiness, always moving toward what feels best. The unsettling reality of behavioral psychology suggests otherwise. Often the human mind does not seek what is good. It seeks what is known. This is the invisible gravity of the mere exposure effect, a psychological phenomenon where people develop a preference for things merely because they are familiar. In the context of a painful relationship, this creates a familiarity bias that can be stronger than your own survival instinct. You return to the person who caused you pain because in the dark map of your subconscious, their specific brand of chaos feels like home. You probably assume that if something hurts, you will naturally move away from it. But for the brain, new is often synonymous with dangerous. To your ancient survival-oriented mind, a known predator is a predictable variable, while an unknown savior is a terrifying uncertainty. Psychologists still debate whether this preference for the familiar is an evolutionary byproduct of neophobia, the fear of anything new, which kept our ancestors from eating poisonous berries or wandering into rival territories. When you are standing at the edge of leaving, the unknown looks like a vast cold void. In contrast, the person who hurts you represents a set of familiar patterns. You know how they yell, you know how they apologize, and you know how to navigate their moods. There is a perverse comfort in that predictability. Maybe this is happening to you right now. You think about dating someone new, someone kind, and instead of feeling excited, you feel a strange sense of boredom or even anxiety. A healthy, stable person feels like a foreign language you don't speak. You find yourself drawn back to the toxic familiar because you already have the script memorized. This is the safety of shadows. You aren't returning because you enjoy the pain. You are returning because you are terrified of the silence of a life where you don't have a crisis to solve. You have become a specialist in a specific type of suffering, and you are hesitant to give up your expertise. Consider the status quo bias, the emotional preference for the current state of affairs. The mind perceives any change from the baseline as a loss. Even if the status quo is objectively miserable, the brain views the act of leaving as a cost. We see this in the default effect. People tend to stick with the default option provided to them because making a new choice requires significant cognitive energy and carries the risk of regret in your life. The person who causes you pain has become your default. To choose a different path requires a level of executive function that your exhausted, stressed mind simply cannot muster. So you click the renew button on your misery, not because you want it, but because it is the easiest path for a tired brain to take. There is a surprising hidden behavior insight in the way the brain processes conceptual metaphors. We often equate closeness with safety, regardless of the quality of the connection. From the time you were an infant, being physically and emotionally close to a primary figure meant survival. If that early closeness was intertwined with volatility, your brain wired the two together. Now, as an adult, a relationship without a degree of intensity or pain might actually feel unsafe or fake to you. You return to the source of your pain because your nervous system misinterprets the adrenaline of conflict as the warmth of intimacy. You are mistaking the racing pulse of fear for the fluttering heart of love. You assume your choices are based on your current needs, but they are often echoes of your earliest blueprints. This is the philosophy of compulsion to repeat, a concept where individuals repeat a traumatic event or its circumstances over and over again. The mind hopes that by re-entering the painful scenario, it can finally master it and achieve a different outcome. It's a tragic, invisible mental trap. You aren't just returning to a person. You are returning to a fundamental question you've been trying to answer since childhood. You think you are moving forward, but you are actually walking in a circle, tracing the same grooves that were worn into your psyche long before you knew how to name them. Maybe you think you are brave for staying and fixing things, but take a moment to look at the aversion to ambiguity. Humans would rather have a certain negative outcome than an uncertain one. This is why people stay in dead-end jobs and why they return to people who break their hearts. The pain you know has boundaries. You know where it starts and where it ends. The happiness you don't know is an abyss. You return because the mind is a master of loss aversion, as we noted before. But specifically, it fears the loss of a known identity. If you aren't the person who is dealing with this relationship, who are you? The fear of that empty space is often enough to drive you back into the fire. Consider the availability heuristic. Your brain makes judgments based on the most immediate examples that come to mind. If your most intense, vivid memories are with this person, even the painful ones, your brain overestimates their importance in your life. The quiet moments of peace you've had alone feel thin compared to the high-definition drama of the relationship. You return because your brain tells you that this person is the biggest thing in your world. You are looking through a magnifying glass at a thorn and wondering why you can't see the rest of the garden. You trust your sense of belonging, but belonging is a dangerous word when applied to a cage. The mere exposure effect suggests that the more we see something, the more we like it, even if that something is a person who treats us with contempt. This is a hidden manipulation of the environment. If your social circle, your home, and your daily habits are all built around this person, your brain is being constantly exposed to the stimulus of them. You return because you are environmentally primed to do so. You are a creature of a specific ecosystem, and even if the air is toxic, it's the only air you know how to breathe. Maybe this is happening to you right now. You are confusing familiarity with destiny. You think that because this person feels so right in your bones, they must be your soulmate. But your bones don't know the difference between a soulmate and a habit. They only know what they have felt 10,000 times before. The mind is not always your ally. Sometimes it is just a creature of comfort that would rather be bruised in a warm bed than safe in a cold one. You aren't returning to a person. You are returning to the only version of the world you've been trained to survive. Remember that false certainty from earlier, the belief that your return is a conscious decision made by yourself. We like to think of our minds as the captains of our ships, but beneath the surface of your conscious thought, there is a chemical tide that dictates your movements. When you return to someone who has caused you pain, you aren't just battling thoughts or memories. You are battling a biological anchor. This is the realm of trauma bonding, a phenomenon where the brain's survival circuitry creates a physical hormonal dependency on the person who oscillates between being the source of your fear and the source of your comfort. You probably assume that fear and love are opposites, but in the laboratory of the human nervous system, they are deeply intertwined. When you are hurt or threatened by someone you are attached to, your body releases a flood of cortisol, the stress hormone. This is your fight or flight system activating. However, because this person is also your primary source of intimacy, your brain simultaneously seeks safety in them. This triggers the release of oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone. Psychologists still debate whether this oxytocin surge is a direct survival mechanism to appease a predator or a tragic misfiring of the attachment system. Regardless, the result is a biological cocktail that welds your nervous system to the very person who is damaging it. You aren't just missing them, you are experiencing a chemical craving for the regulator of your internal state. Maybe this is happening to you right now. You feel a frantic, almost primal need to see them even after an argument that left you trembling. This isn't passion. It is your body trying to use oxytocin to soothe the cortisol spike they created. You are caught in a self-perpetuating loop. The more they hurt you, the more stressed you become. And the more stressed you become, the more your brain demands the fix that only their presence can provide. It is a form of biochemical Stockholm syndrome. You return to the source of the pain because your body has forgotten how to produce its own calm. Consider the misattribution of arousal. In a classic study, researchers found that people are more likely to feel attraction to someone if they meet them in a high-anxiety situation, like on a shaky suspension bridge. The brain feels the racing heart and the sweaty palms of fear and mislabels them as the signs of love. In a painful relationship, the constant drama keeps your adrenaline levels high. You confuse the physiological noise of conflict with the spark of chemistry. You return because a stable, peaceful relationship feels boring by comparison. Your nervous system has become addicted to the high-octane fuel of crisis. You are a thrill seeker who doesn't realize the thrill is actually your body's alarm system. There is a surprising hidden behavior insight in the way the brain handles neural plasticity and fear conditioning. Much like Pavlov's dogs, your brain has been trained to associate certain triggers, a specific tone of voice, a scent, or even a particular room with the cycle of pain and relief. Over time, these neural pathways become like deep canyons. It takes massive effort to climb out of them, but it's effortless to slide back in. This is the biological anchor. Even when your logical mind says stay away, a simple "I'm sorry" text can trigger a massive release of dopamine and oxytocin, overriding your executive function and pulling you back into the groove. You assume your heart is leading the way, but your heart is just a pump reacting to a chemical script written by your amygdala. In the philosophy of human nature, we often romanticize the idea of undying love that survives through abuse and neglect. We call it soulmates or twin flames. But through the lens of behavioral science, this undying quality is often just the rigidity of a trauma bond. It is a connection forged in the heat of survival, not the light of flourishing. You return because you are biologically tethered to the person who holds the keys to your chemical equilibrium. Maybe you think your resilience is your strength, but take a look at the Stockholm effect in interpersonal relationships. When a person feels they cannot escape a source of threat, the brain begins to identify with the aggressor as a defense mechanism. By understanding them, by feeling for their trauma, you create a psychological bridge that makes the pain feel more tolerable. You return because your mind has convinced you that your survival depends on your ability to stay in their good graces. You have traded your autonomy for a fragile sense of safety. Consider the endogenous opioid system. Research suggests that social rejection and physical pain share the same neural pathways. When you are discarded or hurt by someone, your brain perceives it as a physical wound. When they return and offer affection, your brain releases natural opioids endorphins to dull the pain. You are literally using the person who hurts you as a form of pain relief. This is why the makeup phase feels so euphoric. It is a literal drug hit. You return to the person who caused the wound because they are the only ones holding the morphine. You trust your gut, but your gut is currently being manipulated by a hormonal imbalance. The hidden manipulation here isn't necessarily a conscious strategy by the other person. It is a systemic failure of your own internal biology. Your System 1 thinking is screaming that this person is essential for your survival. You feel incomplete without them because your body has stopped functioning normally in their absence. You are a biological machine that has been hacked by its own attachment software. Think about the physical sensation of longing you feel. Is it a peaceful, expansive feeling, or is it a tight, desperate, and suffocating one? You think you are returning because of a deep spiritual connection, but you might just be returning because you are experiencing a chemical crash. The mind is not always your ally. Sometimes it is just a pharmacy running a very dangerous promotion. You aren't returning to a person. You are returning to the only substance that can stop the withdrawal symptoms of your own trauma. Remember that false certainty from earlier, that persistent nagging belief that at the end of the day, you are the one holding the pen. We have journeyed through the architecture of your mind from the sunk costs that trap your logic to the chemical anchors that bind your nervous system. But we must finally confront the most unsettling truth of all the illusion of agency. You return to those who cause you pain, not because you are weak, but because you are a passenger in a vehicle driven by ancient, invisible programs. In the quiet theater of your consciousness, you are watching a movie and believing you wrote the script, while in reality the ending was determined by the determinism of habit and the biological mandates of your ancestors. You probably assume that free will is the foundation of your identity, but psychologists still debate whether the feeling of making a choice is simply a retrospective hallucination, a story your brain tells itself to explain an action that has already been initiated by the subconscious. When you turn that door handle once more, your System 2 logic arrives a millisecond too late, only to provide a rationalization for a reflex that was triggered in the System 1 depths of your amygdala. You aren't choosing to return. You are witnessing your return and calling it forgiveness. This is the ultimate hidden manipulation, the mind's ability to convince you that your compulsions are actually your convictions. Maybe this is happening to you right now. You are standing at a crossroads weighing the pros and cons as if they matter, but the weights are already fixed. The surprising hidden behavior insight here is that the more stressed and exhausted we are, the more we lean on our basal ganglia, the part of the brain responsible for habits and repetitive behaviors. When life is heavy, your executive function in the prefrontal cortex tires out, and you default to your most deeply ingrained path. For you, that path leads back to the person who knows your vulnerabilities best. You aren't making a fresh decision. You are simply running a high-definition macro on a tired operating system. Consider the illusion of control. We have a fundamental psychological need to believe we can influence outcomes even in situations that are governed by chance or deep-seated pathology. By returning, you are attempting to exercise control over a chaotic situation. You think, this time, if I change my tone, if I am more patient, if I am more understanding, the outcome will be different. But this is a cognitive mirage. You are trying to use logic to solve a problem that is fundamentally biological and structural. You return because the alternative, admitting that you have no power over the other person's behavior, is a philosophical ego death that your mind is not yet ready to face. There is a dark philosophy in the realization that we are often just biosocial feedback loops. You react to their cruelty, they react to your reaction, and the cycle reinforces itself until the friction becomes the only thing that makes you feel alive. We are creatures of homeostasis. Your system seeks a state of equilibrium, and if your equilibrium has been set to high-tension conflict, your brain will actually work to sabotage peace, because peace feels like a malfunction. You return to the pain because your internal thermostat is broken and it thinks the burn is the correct temperature for love. Maybe you think you are learning something each time you go back, but are you? Or are you just refining your ability to endure? In the philosophy of human nature, we must ask if we are truly evolving or if we are just optimizing our obsessions. You assume your history with this person is a bridge to a better future, but it might just be a Mobius strip. a path that looks like it's going somewhere but only ever leads back to the start. You return because the mind finds the circle more aesthetically pleasing than the cliff. Leaving is a cliff, returning is a circle, and the human mind is terrified of falling. Take a moment to reflect on the affective forecasting error. We are notoriously bad at predicting how we will feel in the future. You return because you overpredict the pain of being alone and underpredict the pain of being mistreated. You are making decisions based on a distorted forecast. You think the loneliness will be a 10 out of 10 on the pain scale, when in reality it might be a 4 that eventually fades to a 0. Meanwhile, you treat the recurring heartbreak as a manageable 3, when it is actually a slow-acting poison that is eroding your capacity for joy. You are a bad accountant in a failing business, and you are returning to the office because you don't know how to stop being an employee. You trust your intuition, but intuition is just pattern recognition. If the patterns of your life have been built on insecure attachment, then your intuition will always point you toward people who trigger that insecurity. It feels right because it matches the pattern. This is the safety of the known we discussed earlier, but on a spiritual level. You return because you are looking for a key that fits your specific lock, not realizing that the lock itself was designed to keep you trapped. You are looking for a home in a place that was only ever meant to be a hallway. Think about the silence after this video ends. That is the unknown. That is the space where the narrative shield drops and the hormonal anchor loses its grip. You think you are returning for the person, but you are actually fleeing from that silence. You are fleeing from the terrifying responsibility of having to define yourself without the conflict. The mind is not always your ally. Sometimes it is an expert jailer who has convinced you that you are the one holding the keys. The mind is not always your ally. Sometimes the greatest illusion is believing you are ever fully in control. We spend our lives building altars to our choices, lighting candles of reason to justify why we stay, why we wait, and why we walk back into the arms of our own destruction. We tell ourselves we are healers or martyrs or lovers of depth. But beneath the poetry lies the prose of a biological machine, repeating a cycle because it doesn't know how to do anything else. The hardest part of waking up isn't realizing that you were hurt. It's realizing that you were the one who kept turning the handle. The mind will give you 1,000 reasons to return tonight. But remember, a reason is not the same thing as a truth. Sometimes the only way to find yourself is to get lost in the unknown and finally let the door stay closed.